Thank you very much, Colin. And Colin is an old friend, and he stole my thunder because I was going to say the same thing about him. He's a real patriot. I don't know that he's virtually ever missed one of those meetings, and if you think about it, they've been going on since the week after the elections in 2008. So it's a rather remarkable accomplishment on his part. I want to talk about something different than the media today, because I think we need to have a serious conversation on this. I'd like us to ask ourselves this question. Why is it that at the height of Ronald Reagan's popularity in 1987, I believe it was, the number of conservatives in America was at 30%. If you ask people today how many call themselves conservatives, it's gone up to 44%. It's almost a 50% increase. So, why is it that we conservatives, if we're going to be honest with one another, have lost virtually every single public policy debate since Ronald Reagan? And if we haven't lost, we have been in retreat on every single one, if we've almost doubled our numbers. I'd like to talk about that today because I think that we need to realize that we have been fighting on the wrong battlefield this whole time. Last summer, there was a piece of legislation that was introduced that I suspect no one in this room is familiar with. It wasn't reported in the press. It was Senate Joint Resolution number 19. SJ 19 was an effort by a Democratic subcommittee to, I'm not kidding you, amend the First Amendment. The amendment to the amendment would have given Congress the control to regulate campaigns and to decide what was and what wasn't acceptable as campaign activity in the weeks leading up to the campaign. Senator Ted Cruz challenged them. He asked them, does this not give you the right to control movies in America? After all, a movie like 2012 by Dinesh D'Souza was all about a campaign. Does it not give them the right, would it not give them the right to control television? Madam Secretary is a TV show advancing Hillary Clinton. Would it not give them the right to control editorial comments in newspapers? What about commentaries on television? What about yard signs? What about bumper stickers? What about flyers? What form of communication would the federal government not be able to control? Free speech, remember, the cornerstone of American society, had they succeeded. So Senator Ted Cruz proposed something different. He proposed his own amendment. He proposed the First Amendment. Ladies and gentlemen, every single Democrat voted against it. I'm going to suggest to you that something terrible is happening in this country unless we do something about it. Tyranny is at our door, and the radical cultural left is hell-bent on preventing you from having a voice in the public conversation. Consider the IRS scandal. What was that all about? It was about the federal government preventing conservatives from having a voice in public policy. Conservative organizations were harassed, were persecuted, were even prosecuted in an attempt to shut them down. New organizations were prevented from getting their 501c3 tax-deductible status. The IRS, it turned out, was coordinating its activities with the Department of Justice. That's illegal. The IRS was coordinating its activities, sharing donor lists with the Federal Election Commission. That's illegal. Lois Lerner and company were destroying evidence. Need I not say that's illegal? They were lying at the White House, and on the other end of Pennsylvania Avenue at the Capitol, they were committing perjury. Now, ladies and gentlemen, Watergate was a paper cut by comparison. And how many people know? How many people know that it's continuing? That the same activity that was exposed continues to this day with no ability, no effort by the Republicans to stop them. The left is showing its fangs, and it's dangerous. Rush Limbaugh, talk radio, perhaps the most powerful voice of conservatism today. They've been after him. In 1993, they introduced the Fairness Doctrine. What would the Fairness Doctrine have done? Sounds good. What it would mandate is that a station owner would have to give equal voice to a counterpart of Rush Limbaugh. There is no counterpart to Rush Limbaugh. They've tried it for years. Whether it's Jim Hightower or Mario Cuomo or Doug Wilder, Jesse Jackson, every single one of them has been given national talk shows. Every single one of them has failed because they don't have audiences. But what would happen if you had the Fairness Doctrine? The Fairness Doctrine would mandate that a station owner put one of them on the air, which would be a huge financial catastrophe. So what would he do? He'd have to cancel Rush Limbaugh and go to country music or something. And that was their intention. Now that failed. Then they came back in with localism. Rush himself called it the back door to the Fairness Doctrine. That too was stopped. But does that mean that the Federal Communications Commission has stopped? Consider this. How many of you know last summer they were exposed with an effort, the FCC, the federal government, to put a minder in every newsroom in America to make sure that they were presenting the proper news philosophy, that they were selecting the, quote, process by which stories were selected, and perceived station bias was being controlled. Ladies and gentlemen, what's the difference between that and Cuba, and Iran, and North Korea, and the East German Stasi, where you had governments spying, harassing, persecuting, and controlling speech in their countries? We have it here. Net neutrality. The FCC introduced that. And what would net neutrality do? Sounds so good. Net neutrality gives the federal government control of the most powerful form of communication in America today. Whoever controls the highway, which is what the federal government, unless it's stopped, does now control, now controls who's on that highway and how the driver gets to drive and when the driver gets to drive and what he gets to drive. That's the the argument that they have. But even worse, right behind the FCC has come the Federal Election Commission. And it is suggesting that what's on the internet is political activity. The political speech is political activity. And therefore, it needs to be treated as a political contribution. So Matt Drudge would be a political contribution to be regulated. Any blogger would be a political contribution. Any one of you involved, the Pennsylvania Leadership Conference, a website would be a political contribution, and you would be regulated by the federal government. Again, what's the difference between that and North Korea? If the federal government doesn't succeed, if they can't use the federal government, the radical left has another weapon. It's personal destruction. Think about Brandon Ike and the Mozilla Corporation. What was his sin? He made a $1,000 contribution to support marriage. The radical left came after him. They blasted him with a complaint, national news media, as being a hater, and Mozilla, therefore, being an army of homophobia. They created such trouble for him, he was forced to resign from his own company. Dan Cathy, Chick-fil-A, the exact same thing happened to him. The only difference being that the national evangelical movement, primarily, came to his defense and stopped the radicals from it. But it doesn't mean that they're stopping. The American Legislative Exchange Council, ALEC, very good organization with a tremendous reputation. They were the ones who in Florida came up with the Stand Your Ground model legislation. Then Trayvon Martin was killed, and the radicals saw their opportunity. They pounced not on ALEC, but on ALEC's contributors and said, we are going to attach that murder to you. And you are going to be labeled as haters, and you're going to be labeled as racists, and everything else. In short order, Kraft Foods, McDonald's, Pepsi-Cola, Coca-Cola, they all took to the tall grass and fled. And that was the end of the major funding for ALEC. Character assassination is a very powerful weapon for a ruthless movement without honor and a conscience. Ask Rush Limbaugh again. When they couldn't go after him legally, they tried character assassination. They came after him with the phony soldier story. The accusation was that he had accused American veterans who were against the war in Iraq of being phony soldiers. He had said no such thing. The transcript is there for anyone to read. He was talking about people who were impersonating soldiers to get Army veterans benefits. There were some 60 different cases being prosecuted at the time. That didn't stop the left. They launched a national campaign, Harry Reid on down, denouncing as being anti-military and against the brave men and women who are shedding their lives, shedding the blood and giving their lives on the battlefield. It was a ferocious battle that he had with them. Well, Rush is Rush, and he finally persevered. He actually humiliated them in the process. It didn't stop them. They came right back last year. They suggested Rush Limbaugh is now condoning sexual violence. Stop and think about that for a second. Condoning sexual violence. Next thing you know, hundreds of thousands of tweets went to all of his advertisers, particularly the small ones, the mom and pop shops, the most vulnerable ones, accusing him of condoning sexual violence and saying that they had to distance themselves from it. That was pretty tough stuff, and they might have succeeded until Rush hired the most sophisticated agency in the country to examine what was happening. Come to find out, it was 17 people. 17 of these cultural radicals using the most sophisticated technology available to them to give the perception of hundreds of thousands of people complaining when there's no such thing. The radicals have set their eyes on the next stage, Hollywood. Now, ladies and gentlemen, there is no greater hypocrisy than Hollywood. Hollywood, which preaches tolerance at every opportunity, but practices the most egregious form of intolerance imaginable. David Benham, along with his brother, James, two good Christians, successful businessmen, they were going to have a new TV show on HGTV. And then David Benham did something very, very wrong. He went on talk radio and he quoted the Bible. I don't kid you. He said this, in Leviticus, it says that death is the consequence of homosexual sin. However, Jesus came and took the consequences of their sin upon himself on the cross. A beautiful statement from the Bible. But that was enough. They thundered after him. Homophobe. How could HGTV have this man, these brothers, on this national show, these hate-filled homophobes? HGTV canceled their show. Phil Robertson of Duck Dynasty, they tried the same thing against him. But as with Dan Cathy and Chick-fil-A, there was a national outpouring of support. It doesn't hurt that he was the #1 show on cable television. There was a national outpouring of support, and that saved him. Friends of Abe. Friends of Abe is a libertarian organization in Hollywood. You know some of the ringleaders, Kelsey Grammer, Gary Sinise, John Voight. But you don't know the hundreds, the thousands of others involved in Friends of Abe. Do you know why? Because they're afraid for their careers to be public. Because if their names come out publicly, their careers are endangered. You wonder if that happens to any other liberal organization in America? They've set their sights on college campuses. Today, in 409 college campuses, 62% have speech codes controlling free speech. I'll give you some examples. At Vanderbilt University, a Christian youth group's application to organize on that campus was deferred because the rules state that a member must be a Christian. At the University of North Carolina on Chapel Hill, a Christian student group came under fire from the administration because it had the audacity to dismiss from its membership a member who wasn't a Christian. At the University of Mary Washington, the student newspaper had to change its name from the Bullet because it propagated violence. At Drake University, a conservative student newspaper was vandalized and destroyed all over campus. What sin had it committed? It had featured a pro-life ad. At the University of Massachusetts, at Amherst, the conservative newspaper was stolen and destroyed. When the conservative students complained to the administration did what only a college from Massachusetts would do. They banned the student newspaper. At the University of Minnesota, a professor encouraged students to destroy the copies of the student newspaper. At Oregon State, the university had to pay a $101,000 legal fine when the professors had to admit that they themselves had destroyed the student newspapers. At the University of California in Santa Barbara, 2 young, sweet little high school girls who were holding pro-life signs were accosted by a thuggish professor and her aides, where their property was destroyed after it was taken, and these poor girls were taunted, all on camera. And by the way, that professor was charged and pled guilty. But it's no hyperbole to say that conservatives on college campuses now live in fear. Think now what's happening on the cultural front with new business opportunities in the gay movement. We've all seen what happened at Memory's Pizza in Walkerton, Indiana. To recap, a gay couple went to a pizza store owned by Christians and said they wanted it to cater their wedding. Stop for a second. They didn't deserve to be married if all they can do is pizza at their reception. But that couple, based on Christian beliefs, said we can't. They said very quickly, we will serve any gay. We have always served gays, but it's different to cater a wedding that we believe is sinful. We can't do it. And you saw the national outrage by the radicals on the cultural left against them. Now, if you think this is an isolated example, folks, this is also going on all over the country. The New Mexico Human Rights Commission, and already you know when it's a Human Rights Commission in the United States that that's an insult. But they levied a $6,000 fine against a woman who declined to photograph a lesbian commitment ceremony. In Oregon, a Christian bakery refused to make a wedding cake for a lesbian couple, and at last I saw we're facing fines in excess of $150,000. In Idaho, 2 Christian ministers who own a wedding chapel were ordered to perform a same-sex wedding or face a possible jail term of 3 years with a $1,000 fine for every day of noncompliance. In Houston, the radical mayor, an outspoken lesbian, dispatched city attorneys to churches around the city, demanding that the pastors surrender all speeches, sermons, and writings that talked about gender identity or homosexuality or mentioned her. Again, you can thank Ted Cruz for going down to Houston and putting an end to that. Liberals like Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton and the Reverend Jeremiah Wright go to churches every Sunday, they stand behind the pulpits, and they thunder politics. Some conservative pastors became tired of the double standard, where they were told they couldn't as tax-deductible organizations. So they organized Pulpit Freedom Sunday. The moment they did, the cultural radicals struck again. The Freedom from Religion Foundation sued. But they didn't sue the pastors. They sued the IRS for not sufficiently prosecuting the pastors. The IRS settled, and as part of the settlement, has now agreed to monitor churches more carefully for their political content. Some Christian leaders are so afraid, and some conservative leaders are so fearful, they walk with armed bodyguards today. Think about that. I gave a speech at a synagogue about a year ago. When I arrived, I was assigned a bodyguard who stood next to me all evening long because of the death threats that this synagogue regularly received. Now think of a liberal anywhere who has to live that way with that kind of harassment. And if you think that that is paranoia, Colin and Hannah will back me up on this. At that very spot where we meet every Wednesday, that's at the Family Research Council, that office was labeled a hate group and put on a hate map by the Southern Poverty Law Center. A radical gay activist went on that site, and he decided that he was going to take matters into his own hand. He entered that lobby. It would have been shortly after our breakfast would have ended, or at the time our breakfast would have ended, had this been on a Wednesday, but it was on a Thursday. He entered the lobby, pulled out a gun, and opened fire. He shot the security guard, Leo, in the arm and wounded him quite seriously. But Leo, being the great guy that he is, subdued this man. When he was subdued, they found that he had a bag. And in that bag, he had a bunch of Chick-fil-A sandwiches. He later would tell authorities it was his intention to shoot and kill as many people from that office and place a sandwich next to each corpse. They're trying to rewrite history. In Seattle, Washington, you no longer have Columbus Day. You now have Indigenous Peoples Day. In Denver, Colorado, there was a massive rally organized by these cultural liberals to stop patriotism from being taught in schools. History books are being rewritten to erase America's grounding in the Judeo-Christian tradition and to erase from the public records America's role as a leader of the free world. American exceptionalism is no longer allowed to exist. And then when they get down to the nitty-gritty, they teach students that the Reagan tax cuts caused the Reagan deficits. That Reagan's policies on AIDS caused AIDS to begin with. What about the Cold War? Well, it never existed. Do you think I kid you? Strobe Talbot, from Time magazine, later an ambassador for Bill Clinton to Russia, wrote this. He declared that Gorbachev is helping the West by showing that the Soviet Union isn't what it used to be, and what's more, never was. Through Common Core, they are now teaching that George Washington was no different than Palestinian terrorists. Jefferson was a hypocrite because he wrote the Declaration of Independence and he owned states. He owned slaves. They've equated patriots fighting in the Revolutionary War as American mobs. They've said that the Boston Tea Party was, quote unquote, too radical for some. They asked this question to children. If a Palestinian suicide bomber kills several dozen Israeli teenagers in a Jerusalem restaurant, is that an act of terrorism or wartime retribution against the Israeli government and its policies and army actions? Jeb Bush, don't be supporting Common Core. David Griss, David Roberts works for the radical left blog site Grist. This is what he wrote about our opposition to climate change, which used to be known as global warming, which was also known as global cooling. He said, when we finally gotten serious about global warming, we should have war crimes for those bastards who opposed it. Some sort of climate Nuremberg. It's come to this. There's only one scientific position permissible in the climate debate. There's only one morally acceptable position on gay rights. Freedom is oppression, free enterprise is confiscatory, morality is immorality, and the Washington Redskins is hate speech. Censorship is everywhere. We can no longer trust God on our coins, pray in our schools, or have a crucifix uncovered when the President of the United States is standing in front of it. Our beliefs are insensitive. What's insensitive is intolerant. What is intolerant is hateful, and what is hateful should be criminalized. Do I exaggerate? In a recent poll, 51% of Democrats believe that free speech, as they see it, should be criminalized. Ladies and gentlemen, Webster defines fascism as, quote, a tendency toward or actual exercise of strong autocratic or dictatorial control. Cultural fascism has arrived in America, and that, not politics, is what we're facing. We know this to be true. What's been our response? What should be our response? Is it to surrender to the fascists? Oh, fighting along the way, but fighting defensively and in retreat, grudgingly but gradually, until that point where we have reached where they wanted us to be, the transformed society, where freedom is an ever more distant memory. Is this your gift to your progeny after millions of men and women shed their blood and gave their lives to give you the freedom that you inherited? God help us if that's your belief. I don't ask you to defend yourself in this battle. What I ask you is to stop the retreat. Turn around and charge. And when you charge straight to the sound of the guns. Maybe it's time for us to become intolerant. Maybe it's time for us. Maybe it's time for us to become intolerant of any political leader from any political party who refuses to stand up and fight for freedom in America today. And maybe while we're at it, we need to become intolerant of the thousands of lobbyists and professional consultants prowling the halls of Congress like rats. Maybe it's time to become intolerant of the cultural fascism in academia. It's so easy. Drain the swamp. Stop sending your children and your money to organizations who believe in the opposite of free speech. Do not tolerate attacks on conservative leaders. Rally behind them. And don't just defend them, but pinpoint the attackers and denounce them for their attacks. I'm sick and tired of our people coming under fire unfairly, unjustly, and immorally. We have the weapons. We have the weapons to fight back. And by the way, before I close, this Christmas, this December, everyone you see, it is no longer a happy holiday. It's Merry Christmas. We have the technology. If you believe in freedom, take to the rafters and proclaim it. Tell your story. Tell America's story. Tell future generations what America once was, what America could be, and what America should be. Our founders will be vindicated. Your progeny will be grateful. And I suspect the Almighty is going to be very happy with us all. Thank you very much.